Althea Navarro had dismantled Fortune 500 companies with a single PowerPoint slide, but sitting alone at table 12 while couples swirled around the dance floor, she felt smaller than the day she'd first pitched from a hospital bed. The ivory linens and crystal glasses of the Riverside Chapel reception hall sparkled under warm amber lighting, but she might as well have been invisible behind a wall of her own success. Her custom wheelchair, sleek titanium that cost more than most people's cars, was tucked precisely beneath the elegantly draped table. She'd positioned herself strategically in the corner where she could observe without becoming the object of those careful, sympathetic glances that made her skin crawl. The same glances she'd been dodging for 7 years. Have you ever felt invisible in a crowd of people who know exactly who you are? The bride, Christina, floated past in clouds of silk and tulle, radiant with the kind of joy that Althea remembered from before. Before the accident, before the rebuilding, before she'd learned that success was a cold companion on nights like these. Christina caught her eye and waved, mouthing, "Thank you for coming," over the string quartet's gentle melody. Althea lifted her champagne flute in response, painting on the practiced smile that had closed million-dollar deals and graced magazine covers. But as soon as Christina spun away in her new husband's arms, the smile faded. Table 12 was labeled Friends of the Bride, a diplomatic way of saying people we couldn't fit anywhere else. The other seats remained empty, their occupants having migrated to the bar, the photo booth, or more exciting conversations with people who didn't require the emotional labor of careful inclusion. Althea checked her phone reflexively, scrolling through emails from her VP of Operations about the Morrison account, quarterly projections that needed her review, investor calls scheduled for Monday morning. The blue glow of her screen felt more familiar than the warm laughter surrounding her. Technova Solutions, her baby, her empire built from the ashes of everything she'd lost. It demanded constant attention. 14-hour days, weekend strategy sessions, red-eye flights to pitch meetings where she proved again and again that a woman in a wheelchair could outthink, out-strategize, and out-execute anyone in Silicon Valley. But none of that mattered here, where success was measured in wedding invitations and plus ones, where the ability to navigate a dance floor counted more than navigating corporate politics. The DJ's voice crackled over the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the bride and groom's first dance." Althea's chest tightened as couples began migrating toward the parquet floor. She'd learned to time these moments perfectly. Bathroom break, phone call, sudden interest in the gift table. Anything to avoid the hollow ache of watching others move to music while she remained stationary. She was reaching for her clutch when a voice cut through the wedding chatter like warm honey over broken glass. "Excuse me, would you mind if I sat here? You look like you could use some company." Althea froze, her hand halfway to her purse. The voice carried the gentle lilt of Central America, warm and unhurried. She looked up to see a man in his early 30s, dressed in crisp white shirt and black slacks that marked him as staff rather than guest. His dark hair was neatly combed, his brown eyes kind but not pitying, a distinction she'd learned to recognize instantly. Behind him, abandoned by the far wall, sat a industrial mop bucket that explained everything and nothing at once. "You're not a guest," she said, more curious than accusatory. His smile reached his eyes first, then spread to transform his entire face. "No, ma'am. I'm Luis Ortega. I work maintenance here at the chapel." He gestured toward the forgotten mop bucket. "But I figured maybe tonight I could also be someone's date, if you'd let me." The boldness of it hit her like ice water. CEOs didn't get asked out by janitors. Not in the carefully curated world she inhabited, where every interaction was filtered through net worth and social positioning. Not by men who introduced themselves by their first name and day job without apology or pretense. Drop a heart if you've ever been the only one sitting out the dance. "You want to be my date?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Yes. Simple. Direct. No qualification or explanation. Just truth offered like a gift she hadn't known she needed. For the first time all evening, Althea's practiced smile cracked to reveal something genuine. She gestured to the empty chair beside her with a grace born from years of boardroom negotiations, but her voice carried unfamiliar warmth. Well then, Luis Ortega, have a seat. As Luis settled into the chair beside her, adjusting his posture with the careful courtesy of someone unaccustomed to formal events, Althea found herself studying his hands. They were honest hands, calloused, with small scars that spoke of real work, so different from the soft, manicured fingers of the executives who usually sought her attention. "You're Althea Navarro," Luis said, not a question but quiet recognition. "I read about you in the journal last month, the article about Technova expanding into Latin America." She blinked, genuinely surprised. "You read the Wall Street Journal?" His laugh was soft, self-deprecating. "My abuela always said knowledge was the only thing no one could take from you. I read everything I can get my hands on." He paused, then added with gentle pride, "Your company, it's helping small businesses like the one my cousin runs in Tegucigalpa. He sends me screenshots of your platform, says it changed everything for him." The unexpected personal connection caught Althea off guard. She was used to praise from investors, admiration from competitors, respect from peers, but this, recognition of her work's real impact from someone who lived it, felt different, more real. "That means more than you know," she said, and meant it. The string quartet began the familiar opening notes of "At Last," and couples drifted toward the dance floor like leaves drawn by invisible currents. Althea's jaw tightened reflexively, muscle memory from years of preparing for this moment at every wedding, charity gala, and corporate celebration. Luis noticed her tension immediately. "Bad song?" "Not the song." Althea's fingers traced the rim of her champagne flute, buying time while deciding how much truth to offer. Just complicated memories. She hadn't planned to tell him about David, about the man who'd promised to love her no matter what, right up until the moment what became a wheelchair and a future that looked nothing like the one they'd mapped out together. But something in Luis's patient silence invited honesty. "I was engaged once. Before." She gestured vaguely toward her legs, the universal shorthand she'd developed for everything the accident had changed. "We danced to this song in my apartment kitchen while coffee brewed on Sunday mornings. He said it was our song." Luis waited, understanding that some stories needed space to breathe. After the car accident, 7 years ago, he really tried. Brought me flowers, sat through physical therapy sessions, helped me navigate insurance battles. Althea's voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully examined and filed away but never quite forgotten. But he couldn't look at me the same way. I could see it in his eyes every time I transferred from bed to chair, every time we went somewhere without wheelchair access, every time someone stared. The dance floor filled with swaying couples, their movements synchronized in ways that seemed effortless from this distance. He said he needed time to adjust to our new normal. Needed space to figure out how our relationship would work now. Althea's laugh was sharp, controlled. Turns out what he really needed was permission to leave without feeling like the villain. "I'm sorry," Luis said simply. No platitudes about his loss or her strength, no attempts to minimize the pain with false optimism, just acknowledgement. "Don't be." Losing him taught me something valuable about the difference between love and pity. Between wanting someone and wanting to be seen as someone who wants someone disabled. She met Luis's eyes directly, testing. "Most people can't tell the difference." Luis nodded slowly. "My younger brother had cerebral palsy. Miguel? He died 3 years ago, but he taught me that lesson young. People would ask my parents what was wrong with him, like he was a problem to be solved instead of just Miguel. Funny, stubborn, terrible at soccer, but incredible at chess Miguel." The shared understanding settled between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. "So when David left," Althea continued, surprised by her willingness to share, "I threw everything I had left into Technova. 18-hour days, sleeping in the office, building something so big and successful that no one could ignore me or dismiss me or pity me ever again." She gestured around the reception hall, taking in the elegant crowd, the obvious expense, the casual wealth on display. "And it worked. I built an empire, made the Forbes 30 under 30 list from a hospital bed, expanded internationally before I turned 30, created jobs for thousands of people. What would you do if someone saw you when everyone else looked away?" "But?" Luis prompted gently. Althea smiled ruefully. But empires are cold places to live alone. You can command respect, demand attention, earn admiration, but you can't buy the kind of connection that makes someone choose to sit with you when they could be anywhere else. The song ended, replaced by something upbeat that sent couples spinning and laughing across the polished floor. Althea watched them with the detached observation of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. "My therapist says I use success as armor," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "That I've built Technova into something so impressive that I never have to be vulnerable again. Never have to risk someone leaving because they can't handle loving a woman in a wheelchair." Luis was quiet for a long moment, processing. When he spoke, his voice carried gentle challenge. "But if the armor keeps everyone out, how do you know if someone might actually want to stay?" The question hung between them like a dare, simple and complicated in equal measure. Althea found herself studying Luis's face, the genuine curiosity, the absence of calculation or agenda, the way he looked at her like she was exactly who he wanted to be talking to. "I don't," she said finally. "I guess that's the point." Luis Ortega had been invisible for so long that he'd learned to see everything others missed. It was a superpower born of necessity. When you cleaned up after other people's lives, you developed a radar for loneliness, for the spaces between what people projected and what they actually needed. He'd first noticed Althea Navarro 3 months ago. She'd been here for another wedding, a tech industry colleague's spring ceremony, and had left before the dancing started, wheeling toward the parking lot while the reception was in full swing. Something about the set of her shoulders, the careful way she'd navigated around clusters of chatting guests, had stuck with him. Luis had grown up noticing things others ignored. In his childhood home in East LA, with parents who worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table, he'd learned early that survival meant paying attention. Which neighbor might need help carrying groceries? Which kids at school were hungry? Which teachers saw potential instead of problems? His mother, Rosa, cleaned office buildings downtown for 23 years. She'd come home with stories about the executives who worked late, eating takeout dinners alone at conference tables while the city lights twinkled below their corner offices. "Mijo," she'd tell him in Spanish, pressing a warm tortilla into his hands. "Money doesn't keep anyone warm at night." Luis had inherited her eye for the overlooked, the undervalued, the people who carried their pain quietly. It served him well in his work. He knew which church members were struggling financially, which elderly parishioners hadn't had visitors in weeks, which couples were fighting behind their Sunday morning smiles. And tonight, watching Althea sit alone while celebrations swirled around her, he'd recognized the particular loneliness of someone who'd learned to expect solitude. He'd finished mopping the fellowship hall an hour ago, but hadn't been able to leave. Something about her careful composure, the way she checked her phone to avoid watching couples dance, the practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes, it reminded him of his own reflection during the 2 years after Miguel died. Grief had taught Luis about the weight of carrying invisible burdens. After they lost Miguel to complications from his cerebral palsy, Luis had thrown himself into work, taking extra shifts at the church, volunteering for community cleanup projects, anything to stay busy enough that the silence couldn't catch up with him. People had praised his dedication, called him selfless. What they hadn't seen was the way he'd used service as a shield against his own pain, the way helping others gave him permission to ignore his own need for connection. It was Father Martinez who'd finally called him out. "Luis, my son, you can't heal the world's loneliness while ignoring your own." The priest's words had stung because they were true. Luis had been so busy being needed that he'd forgotten how to let himself need others, how to be seen as more than the reliable guy who fixed things and cleaned up messes. Watching Althea tonight, he recognized the same pattern. Here was someone who'd built her identity around being indispensable, invulnerable, independent. Someone who'd confused being impressive with being loved. The decision to approach her hadn't been calculated. It was instinct. The same impulse that made him stop to help stranded drivers or check on elderly neighbors during heat waves. But asking to be her date, that was different. That was Luis choosing to be seen, choosing to offer not service, but companionship. His hands had trembled slightly as he'd walked across the reception hall, leaving the mop bucket behind like a discarded identity. He'd expected her to decline politely, maybe offer a few minutes of small talk before making her excuses. He hadn't expected her to say yes. Hadn't expected the way her practiced smile had shifted into something genuine when he'd sat down beside her. Hadn't expected to feel the same flutter of possibility that he'd thought died with his dreams of a different life. Luis had grown up bilingual in every sense, not just Spanish and English, but rich and poor, documented and undocumented, visible and invisible. He understood the code switching required to navigate different worlds, the way your posture changed depending on who was watching, the exhaustion of constant translation. But sitting beside Althea, he found himself relaxing into authenticity in a way that surprised him. Maybe it was because she didn't know his story well enough to have expectations. Maybe it was because her own armor recognized his. Or maybe it was simply that they were both tired of performing versions of themselves that kept them safe but separate. "Tell me about your work," she'd said after sharing her own story, and Luis had felt the familiar internal debate. Did he mention the 2 associate degrees earned at night school while working full-time? The carpentry business he'd been planning for 3 years, saving every extra dollar? The furniture designs he sketched in margins of library books because he couldn't afford proper drafting paper? Or did he stick to the simple truth? "I'm the janitor. I clean up after other people's celebrations." Should she say yes to the janitor's bold question? Let me know in the comments. He chose a middle path, the way he'd learned to do when navigating between worlds. "I take care of the building, but I'm also studying business administration through the community college extension program, nights and weekends." He paused, then decided to risk a little more truth. "My goal is to start a custom furniture business. I've been designing pieces for years, building prototypes in my garage." Althea's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. "What kind of furniture?" "Accessible pieces, mostly. Desks and tables that work for wheelchair users, adjustable height surfaces, storage solutions that don't require reaching overhead." Luis felt heat rise in his cheeks. "After my brother Miguel died, I realized how few furniture makers think about disability in their designs. Everything assumes a standard body, standard mobility." The admission hung between them, more personal than he'd intended. He'd never told anyone outside his family about the connection between Miguel's death and his business dreams. But something about Althea's attention, focused, uncalculating, genuinely curious, made him want to be fully seen. "Show me," she said simply. Luis pulled out his phone, scrolling to photos of his latest prototype, a dining table with adjustable height sections, built-in device charging stations, and modular components that could be reconfigured for different needs. He watched Althea's face as she examined the images, noting the way her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine excitement. "This is brilliant," she said, zooming in on the detail shots. "The engineering alone. But also the aesthetic. This doesn't look like medical equipment trying to be furniture. It looks like beautiful furniture that happens to be incredibly smart." Her praise hit him differently than the encouragement he'd received from family and friends. This was assessment from someone who understood both design and business, who could see the commercial potential he'd been too nervous to articulate. "I've been working on a full line," he admitted. "Bedroom furniture, office setups, even outdoor pieces. But going from garage hobby to actual business." He shrugged, not wanting to burden her with his financial constraints, the long timeline his current savings rate imposed. "Have you considered seeking investors? Or applying for small business development grants?" Althea's question was professional, but not dismissive. "There's a huge market opportunity in accessible design, especially with the aging population. And your approach, making accessibility elegant rather than obvious, that's exactly what the market needs." Luis felt a flutter of something he barely recognized as hope. He'd been thinking so small for so long, saving for a workshop rental, maybe a few advertising dollars, a slow bootstrap approach that might take years to generate real income. But Althea was seeing possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. "I wouldn't know where to start with investors," he said honestly. Althea's smile was warm, conspiratorial. I might know a few people. The conversation between them had developed its own rhythm. Comfortable pauses, genuine laughter, the kind of easy connection that usually took weeks to build. Luis found himself forgetting about the mop bucket in the corner, the staff shirt that marked him as employee rather than guest. The vast difference in their worlds that should have made this interaction impossible. Althea had stopped checking her phone entirely, her attention focused with the intensity she usually reserved for quarterly board meetings. But this felt different, personal rather than professional, curious rather than calculating. So, she said, leaning slightly closer to be heard over the band's upbeat cover of Uptown Funk, what made you decide to approach me tonight? And please don't say you felt sorry for me. Luis considered his answer carefully. The truth was complicated, part recognition, part impulse, part something he couldn't quite name yet. Honestly, you look like you were working very hard to be invisible, and I know that feeling. He gestured around the reception hall, taking in the clusters of animated conversation, the laughter, the easy intimacy of people who belonged. I've spent most of my life being the person no one really sees. The guy who empties the trash cans, mops the floors, keeps the lights working. People look through you when you're staff. Althea nodded slowly, understanding. But tonight, watching you sit here alone. Luis paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound presumptuous. It felt like watching someone choose to be invisible instead of having it chosen for them. And I thought maybe we could be visible together. The honesty in his words hit Althea like a physical sensation. Warm, unexpected, a little dangerous. She was used to carefully curated interactions, conversations with hidden agendas, relationships that served strategic purposes. This felt different. Raw. Real. That's either the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, she said, or the most presumptuous. Luis's smile was self-deprecating. Probably both. I'm not exactly experienced at approaching CEOs at weddings. The band transitioned to a slower song. Something classic and romantic that sent couples drifting back to the dance floor in loose embraces. Althea felt the familiar tension creep up her spine, the automatic preparation for another round of watching from the sidelines. But Luis surprised her. Instead of ignoring the music or making awkward small talk to distract from it, he stood and walked around to face her chair. The movement was fluid, confident, without the hesitation she'd learned to recognize in people who weren't sure how to navigate her wheelchair. Althea Navarro, he said, his voice formal but warm, would you do me the honor of this dance? The request stopped her breath entirely. Not because no one had asked. She'd received invitations before, usually from well-meaning relatives or family friends trying to be inclusive. But those had always carried undertones of charity, of someone doing their good deed for the day. This felt different. Luis's posture, his expression, the way he waited for her answer without fidgeting or explaining. Everything about his invitation suggested he genuinely wanted to dance with her, not simply help her feel included. I don't exactly dance, she said, testing. Neither do I, really. But I figured we could figure it out together. The simplicity of it, the absence of overthinking or complex solutions, made something loosen in Althea's chest. She'd spent 7 years learning to navigate a world that wasn't designed for her, developing strategies and workarounds for everything from restaurant tables to airplane bathrooms. The idea that something could be figured out in the moment collaboratively felt almost revolutionary. Okay, she said, surprised by her own voice. Yes. Luis's smile was radiant. He positioned himself beside her chair, then paused, clearly thinking through logistics. May I? He gestured toward her wheelchair handles, asking permission in a way that demonstrated both understanding and respect. Althea nodded, curious about his approach. She'd been pushed by countless people. Medical staff, helpful strangers, family members, but never in a context like this. Never as part of something joyful. Luis's hand settled gently on her chair handles, and then they were moving together toward the dance floor. Not fast, not showy, just a steady progression that felt intentional rather than hesitant. Other couples made space for them naturally, smiles and nods acknowledging their approach without the wide-eyed staring Althea had learned to expect. Luis seemed entirely unbothered by the attention, focused only on guiding them to a spot where they had room to move. Now what? Althea asked, genuinely curious. Now we improvise. Luis began to move them in slow circles, his steps deliberate and rhythmic, matching the tempo of the music. It wasn't traditional dancing, but it was movement and partnership and something entirely their own. Althea felt her body relax into the gentle motion, her hands resting comfortably on her armrests as Luis guided them through wider arcs, figure eights, even a few spins that left her laughing with surprise and delight. "Oh my God," she said, breathless with laughter. "This is incredible. How did you know to do this?" "My brother Miguel," Luis said, his voice warm with memory. "Before he got too sick, we used to dance around the kitchen while our mother cooked dinner. He couldn't walk normally, but he loved music, so we figured out ways to move together that worked for both of us." The explanation landed softly, adding depth rather than sadness to the moment. Althea found herself thinking about adaptation, about the creativity required to make joy possible, about the difference between accommodation and inclusion. Have you ever felt invisible in a crowd? Comment below if you know this feeling. Other dancers had begun to notice them now, but instead of the careful, sympathetic attention Althea usually attracted, she saw genuine appreciation, even admiration. A few couples paused their own dancing to watch and smile. One elderly woman actually applauded when Luis executed a particularly graceful spin. "We're drawing an audience," Althea observed. "Good," Luis said, his voice carrying a note of pride that made her chest tighten with unfamiliar warmth. "Let them see how amazing this is. Let them see how beautiful you are." The words hit her like lightning, not because they were unprecedented, but because of how Luis said them, matter-of-fact rather than consoling, celebratory rather than compensatory. He wasn't trying to make her feel better about her disability. He was simply stating a truth he found self-evident. "Luis," she said, her voice catching slightly. "Yes? Thank you for seeing me, for asking, for not making this about what I can't do." He guided them through another gentle turn before responding. "Althea, this isn't charity. This isn't me being a good guy or trying to prove something. This is me being selfish because you're the most interesting, intelligent, beautiful woman I've met in years, and I don't want this song to end." His words echoed the competitor script she'd analyzed, but felt entirely authentic in this moment, specific to their connection rather than generic romantic sentiment. The song began to wind down, and Luis gradually slowed their movement until they came to a gentle stop near the edge of the dance floor. He came around to face her, and Althea was struck again by his eyes, warm, direct, completely without pity or calculation. "How was that for a first dance?" he asked. "Perfect," she said, and meant it completely. "Though I have to warn you, I might be getting addicted to this. I forgot how good it feels to move to music." Luis's smile was soft, hopeful. "Then maybe we should practice more often." The suggestion hung between them, loaded with possibility and terrifying in its implications. Althea found herself at a crossroads she hadn't expected. Retreat to the safety of her carefully controlled world, or lean into whatever this was becoming. Before she could respond, the moment was interrupted by approaching footsteps and a warm, familiar voice. "Althea, there you are. I've been looking everywhere for you." Christina the bride appeared beside them in a rustle of silk and excited energy, her face flushed with champagne and happiness. She looked between Althea and Luis with undisguised curiosity and delight. "I see you've met Luis," Christina said, her tone carrying layers of meaning that made both of them straighten slightly. "He's been taking care of our chapel for 3 years now. Absolutely the best, fixes everything, notices what needs attention before we even ask." Luis's cheeks darkened slightly, but he extended his hand to Christina with easy courtesy. "Congratulations, Mrs. Patterson. Beautiful ceremony." "Please, it's still Christina for at least another hour," she laughed. "And thank you. But more importantly," she turned to Althea with the particular satisfaction of a successful matchmaker, "I see my seating chart worked out exactly as planned." Althea blinked. "Seating chart?" Christina's grin was unrepentant. "Table 12 wasn't random, honey. I may have mentioned to Luis last week that my brilliant, gorgeous, completely single friend would be sitting alone at the reception, and I may have suggested that someone should keep her company." The revelation hit them both simultaneously. Luis's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked like betrayal, while Althea felt the familiar chill of realizing she'd been managed, handled, set up for someone else's idea of what she needed. "Christina," Althea said slowly, her professional mask sliding back into place. "What exactly did you do?" The confession hung in the air like smoke, changing everything and nothing simultaneously. Christina's well-meaning manipulation had shifted the entire foundation of their connection, raising questions about authenticity that made both Althea and Luis step back mentally, even as they remained physically close. Althea felt the familiar walls rising, the protective barriers she'd built around her heart after too many people had decided what she needed without asking. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the cool professionalism she used to manage unwanted business proposals. So this was. She gestured between herself and Luis, searching for words that wouldn't reveal how much the evening had meant to her. A setup. Luis's jaw tightened, his own pride clearly stung by the implication that he couldn't have approached her without encouragement. "Christina, what did you say to me exactly?" The bride looked between them, her celebration-flushed face beginning to show concern as she recognized the damage her revelation had caused. "Oh no, this came out wrong. I didn't ask you to." "What?" Luis said again, his voice level but firm. "Did you say to me?" Christina took a breath, clearly wishing she could take back her triumphant announcement. "Last week, when you were fixing the sound system, I mentioned that my friend Althea would be coming alone to the reception. I said she was incredible. Successful, beautiful, funny, but that she'd probably sit by herself because she has a hard time believing anyone would want to spend time with her just for who she is." Luis's expression shifted slightly, processing. "And I said," Christina continued, looking directly at him now, "that it would be wonderful if someone just noticed her, talked to her, treated her like the amazing woman she is instead of tiptoeing around her wheelchair." Althea felt her anger begin to complicate into something messier. Christina's description wasn't entirely wrong, but having her vulnerabilities laid bare as part of someone else's romantic strategy felt like betrayal. "I never asked you to do anything specific," Christina said to Luis. "I never suggested you ask her to dance or spend the evening with her. I just hoped someone would see what I see." The distinction mattered, but it didn't eliminate the sting of knowing their connection had been influenced by outside orchestration. Althea looked at Luis, trying to read his expression, wondering how much of his interest was genuine and how much was charitable response to Christina's nudging. Luis seemed to be struggling with similar questions. When he spoke, his voice carried careful consideration. "Did you approach me because Christina asked you to?" Althea asked directly, needing clarity more than comfort. "No." His answer was immediate, certain. "Christina's comments made me more aware of you, but I'd already noticed you. 3 months ago, at the Jensen wedding, you left early. I watched you go and wondered why someone who commanded attention in boardrooms looked so isolated at a celebration." The specific memory, accurate, detailed, clearly genuine, began to soften Althea's defensive posture. "Tonight," Luis continued, "I finished my work an hour ago, but couldn't leave because you looked exactly like I felt after my brother died. Like you were surrounded by joy that belonged to everyone but you. Christina didn't ask me to sit with you. She just helped me understand that my instincts about your loneliness might be right." Christina, sensing an opportunity to repair the damage, jumped in. "Luis, you could have ignored everything I said. You could have finished your shift and gone home. The fact that you chose to approach Althea, chose to ask her to dance, chose to spend your evening here instead of anywhere else, that wasn't my suggestion. That was your decision. What would you do if you found out your perfect evening started with someone else's matchmaking? Let me know in the comments." Althea found herself at another crossroads, but this one felt different. She could retreat into wounded pride, use Christina's interference as justification for pulling away from whatever was developing between her and Luis. Or she could acknowledge that the source of their introduction mattered less than what they'd discovered together. "I need some air," she said finally. Would you like to come with me?" Luis nodded immediately. Yes. They made their way through the reception hall and out to the chapel's garden terrace, leaving Christina with her regrets and good intentions. The evening air was warm, scented with jasmine from the carefully maintained landscaping. String lights created soft pools of illumination among the rose bushes, and the reception's music drifted out through open doors, muffled but still present. Althea positioned her chair facing the garden rather than the building, needing distance from the celebration and its complications. Louise sat on a nearby bench, close enough for conversation, but not presumptuous about sharing her space. "I hate being managed," Althea said finally, her voice carrying years of frustration. "Ever since the accident, people have decided what's best for me, what I need, what I can handle. My ex-fiancé managed me right out of his life. My board of directors tries to manage my public appearances. Well-meaning friends manage my social calendar." Louise listened without interrupting, understanding that she needed to voice this completely. "I've built my entire professional life around being the one who makes decisions, who controls narratives, who manages outcomes. And then I come to a wedding and find out my most genuine connection in years started because someone else decided I needed help." "Did it?" Louise asked gently. "Did it what? Start because someone else decided you needed help?" His voice carried challenge wrapped in kindness. "Because from where I sat, it started because I decided I wanted to know you. Christina's comments didn't create my interest. They just gave me permission to trust it." Althea turned to face him more directly, studying his expression in the soft light. "How do I know the difference?" "Because," Louise said, leaning forward slightly, "I could have brought you a drink and made polite conversation for 10 minutes. I could have asked about your work and nodded appreciatively and wished you a good evening. That would have satisfied any sense of obligation Christina's words created." He was right, she realized. The bare minimum of social courtesy would have fulfilled any charitable impulse. "Instead," Louise continued, "I told you about my brother. I showed you my furniture designs. I asked you to dance and spent an hour figuring out how to make it beautiful for both of us. I shared dreams I've never told anyone outside my family." The truth of it began to dissolve her resistance. Their conversation had gone far beyond polite inclusion or charitable attention. It had been reciprocal, risky, real. "And you," Louise said, his voice softer now, "you told me about your ex-fiancé, about building Technova from pain, about feeling invisible in crowds of people who know your name. You didn't have to share any of that. You could have kept the conversation surface level and still been perfectly gracious." Althea felt her defensive walls cracking, revealing the hope she'd been trying to protect. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe Christina gave us an excuse to do something we both wanted to do anyway. Maybe she provided cover for taking a risk that felt too big to take alone." The insight hit her with the force of recognition. How many times had she used business conferences as cover for traveling to places she wanted to see? Used networking events as excuses to approach people who interested her? Christina's matchmaking might have been the pretext, but their connection had been entirely their own. A slow song drifted out from the reception, something classic and romantic that made couples sway unconsciously even in conversation. Louis stood and extended his hand to Althea, the gesture now familiar but still thrilling. "What do you say we try this again?" he asked. "No Christina, no setup, no audience except the roses, just us figuring out how to dance together." Althea looked at his offered hand, calloused, honest, steady, and made a choice that felt like stepping off a cliff into something that might be wonderful or terrible, but would definitely be authentic. She placed her palm in his. This time, their dance was different. More tentative, but also more intimate, without the buffer of public performance. Louise moved them through the garden's paved pathways, between flower beds and under archways of climbing vines, creating their own private ballroom under the stars. "This is nice," Althea said, surprised by how true it was. "Better than the dance floor?" "Different. More." She searched for the right word. More honest. Louise guided them through a gentle turn around a fountain, its soft splash providing percussion for the distant music. "Can I tell you something?" "Please." "I was terrified to approach you tonight, not because of what Christina said, but because of what I wanted to say. I've been thinking about you for months, wondering what your voice sounded like, what made you laugh, whether you ever felt as invisible as I did." His admission made her chest tighten with recognition and possibility. I spent 3 years after Miguel died telling myself I was too busy for relationships, too focused on work and family obligations. But really I was scared. Scared that getting close to someone meant risking the kind of loss I'd already lived through. Althea understood completely. Grief makes us careful. It does. But so does success, doesn't it? When you've built something significant, something that defines you, the risk of letting someone close enough to change your life feels enormous. The insight was so accurate, it took her breath away. You've given this a lot of thought. I've given you a lot of thought, Louise said simply. More than I probably should have, considering we'd never actually met. They completed another circuit of the garden, moving past clusters of other wedding guests who had spilled outside to smoke or make phone calls or escape the reception's intensity. But none of them seemed to notice the CEO and janitor creating their own celebration among the roses. Luis, Althea said as the distant song began to fade, what happens next? The question carried weight beyond logistics, beyond exchanging numbers or planning coffee dates. It was about two people from different worlds acknowledging that they'd found something unexpected and deciding whether it was worth the risk of pursuing. I don't know, Louise said honestly. I'd like to find out, though, with you. The garden offered temporary sanctuary, but reality waited beyond the rose bushes. As they moved back toward the reception hall, drawn by the sounds of celebration and the practical need to rejoin the world, Althea felt the familiar weight of public attention settling around her shoulders like an unwelcome shawl. She'd learned to navigate social scrutiny with the skill of a diplomat. Smile at the right moments, deflect personal questions with professional accomplishments, gracefully extract herself from conversations that turned condescending or invasive. But bringing Luis back into that environment felt different, more complex. He wasn't her employee or her equal in business terms. He wasn't a safe choice or an expected one. He was a man who cleaned floors for a living, who spoke Spanish with his mother and dreamed of building furniture in his garage. In the carefully stratified world of her usual social circle, their connection would raise eyebrows, generate whispers, require explanations she wasn't sure she was ready to give. Second thoughts? Luis asked gently, apparently reading her hesitation as they approached the terrace doors. Althea considered lying, offering some polite deflection about needing to check work emails or feeling tired. But dishonesty felt wrong after the honesty they'd shared. I'm wondering what people will think, she admitted. About us. About this. Luis slowed their movement, his hands still gentle on her wheelchair handles but no longer directing them toward the reception. What do you think they'll think? That it's odd, that I'm slumming or you're gold digging, that it won't work because we're from different worlds. She paused, then added with brutal honesty, that the successful woman in the wheelchair is so desperate for attention that she'll take it from anyone. The last admission hurt to voice, but it represented her deepest fear, that her interest in Luis would be interpreted as settling, as gratitude for any romantic attention rather than genuine attraction to him specifically. Luis was quiet for a long moment, processing. When he spoke, his voice carried careful thought rather than quick reassurance. Those people, the ones who would think those things, do their opinions matter to you more than what you actually want? The question cut straight through her social anxiety to something more fundamental. Althea had spent her entire career proving herself to skeptics, changing minds through sheer competence and force of will. But this was different. This was personal rather than professional, emotional rather than strategic. I don't know, she said honestly. I've never had to separate what I want from what makes sense for my image. What do you want? Luis asked simply. Althea looked at him, really looked. At his serious dark eyes, his careful posture, the way he waited for her answer without pressure or performance. At the man who'd approached her not because she was successful or impressive, but because she'd looked lonely, and he'd understood that feeling. I want to see what this is, she said. I want to find out if what I felt tonight is real or just gratitude for being seen. And I want to know if the most interesting woman I've ever met might actually want to spend time with a guy who builds furniture and speaks 2 languages and still lives 10 minutes from where he grew up. The mutual confession hung between them like a bridge they could choose to cross or abandon. If someone saw you when everyone else looked away, would you care what others thought? Drop your thoughts below. So what do we do about the whispers? Althea asked. Louise considered this seriously. We could avoid them. Stay out here. Exchange numbers privately. Meet for coffee somewhere no one knows us. Keep this separate from your world and mine. The suggestion was practical, sensible, the kind of careful strategy Althea usually appreciated. But it also felt like exactly the kind of compromise that had kept her isolated for 7 years. Or, she prompted, or we go back in there together. Let people see us, let them draw their conclusions, and decide that what we think of each other matters more than what they think of us. The second option terrified her. But it also felt like the only one that honored what they discovered together. Hiding would mean accepting that their connection was something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. I vote for option 2, she said, surprised by her own resolve. But I have to warn you, once we go back in there as an us, people will have opinions. They'll make assumptions about your motives and my judgment. Some of them will say ugly things. Louise nodded gravely. I've heard ugly things before. People who assume I don't speak English until I respond. People who assume I can't read because I work with my hands. People who assume my family doesn't belong here because my parents have accents. His calm acknowledgement of the prejudice he'd already navigated made Althea feel both protective and inspired. Here was someone who'd faced social judgment without allowing it to limit his choices or define his worth. The difference, Louise continued, is that tonight I met someone who sees me as more than my job title or my bank account or my family's immigration status. Someone who looked at my furniture designs and saw art, not hobby. Someone who talked to me about dreams instead of limitations. He paused, then added with gentle intensity, if people want to judge that, let them. I've spent enough of my life being invisible to everyone except the people who needed me to mop their floors. I'm not about to become invisible to myself by hiding what makes me happy. His words hit Althea like a revelation. She'd spent so much energy managing other people's perceptions that she'd lost track of her own desires, her own right to pursue connection, regardless of how it appeared to outside observers. They moved through the terrace doors and back into the reception hall, which had evolved during their absence. The formal dinner portion was over, replaced by the looser, more relaxed atmosphere of dancing, mingling, and celebration that carried weddings toward their natural conclusions. The change in environment immediately tested their resolve. Althea felt eyes tracking their movement as Louise guided her wheelchair back toward their table. Conversations pausing as people processed the sight of the CEO and the janitor returning together from what was obviously a private conversation. She recognized several faces. Tech industry colleagues, mutual friends of Christina's, people who would definitely have opinions about her romantic choices. The familiar urge to explain, to justify, to manage the narrative rose in her throat. But then, Louise leaned down slightly, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. You look beautiful, he said simply, and I'm proud to be here with you. The words weren't calculated to ease her anxiety or deflect attention. They were just truth, offered without agenda. They reminded her that his opinion was the only one that mattered in this moment. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and smiled. Not her professional smile, but the genuine one Louise had discovered earlier in the evening. I'm proud to be here with you too, she said, loud enough that nearby conversations couldn't help but overhear. The declaration felt like throwing down a gauntlet, claiming her right to choose her own companions without apology or explanation. Some people smiled in response, others looked puzzled, a few appeared disapproving. But none of their reactions changed the fundamental reality. Althea was exactly where she wanted to be, with exactly who she wanted to be with. Louise settled back into his chair beside her, and they rejoined the celebration with new confidence. When people approached to make conversation, some genuinely curious, others obviously fishing for gossip, they presented a united front, comfortable with their connection and uninterested in justifying it to others. The real test came when Margaret Sinclair, a venture capitalist who'd been trying to poach Althea's top engineers for months, approached with the predatory smile Althea recognized from contentious board meetings. "Althea, darling," Margaret said, her voice carrying the false warmth of someone preparing to strike, "I see you found yourself a companion for the evening." The pause before companion was loaded with implications, designed to make both Althea and Louise uncomfortable. It was the kind of microaggression Althea had learned to navigate in business contexts, but bringing it into her personal life felt like a violation. Before Althea could respond with her usual diplomatic deflection, Luis stood and extended his hand to Margaret with perfect courtesy. "Luis Ortega," he said warmly. "You must be another friend of Christina's. Are you enjoying the reception?" His approach, treating Margaret's aggression as misunderstood friendliness, forced her to either escalate to overt rudeness or retreat. Margaret, clearly unprepared for Luis's confident social navigation, found herself shaking his hand and mumbling something about the lovely venue. "Luis is a furniture designer," Althea added smoothly, using the same tone she'd used to introduce any professional colleague. "He's working on some fascinating pieces focused on accessible design. Very innovative work." The reframing, presenting Luis's aspirations as current reality, emphasizing the sophistication of his chosen field, demonstrated that she saw him as an equal worth defending rather than a liability requiring explanation. Margaret's expression shifted from predatory to confused to slightly embarrassed as she realized her intended power play had backfired. She made polite excuses and retreated, leaving Althea and Luis alone again. "Thank you," Luis said quietly. "For what?" "For introducing me as a designer instead of a janitor. For defending my work. For making it clear that you see me the way I want to be seen." Althea felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. Anyone who can't see your value doesn't deserve access to either of us. The evening continued around them, but something had shifted. They'd weathered their first public test as a couple, because that's what they were becoming, Althea realized. Not just two people attracted to each other, but partners choosing to face the world together. When the reception finally wound down and guests began their goodbyes, Althea and Luis found themselves reluctant to let the evening end. The magic they'd discovered felt too precious to release back into ordinary time. The reception hall had taken on the gentle chaos of endings. Guests collecting purses and saying final goodbyes, vendors packing up equipment, the bride and groom making their rounds with exhausted but radiant faces. Althea found herself reluctant to join the exodus, unwilling to let the evening's magic dissolve into Monday morning reality. Luis seemed to share her hesitation. He'd been quiet for the past 30 minutes, not withdrawn but thoughtful, as if he too was trying to figure out how to preserve what they'd discovered together. "I should probably start thinking about heading home," Althea said finally, testing the words to see how they felt. "Early meetings tomorrow, and I've got a presentation to the Morrison Group at 10. "Of course," Luis said, but she heard reluctance in his voice that matched her own. "Can I walk you to your car?" The offer was simple courtesy, but it carried the weight of a first date ending, of two people deciding whether tonight had been an isolated moment or the beginning of something larger. They made their way through the thinning crowd, Luis walking beside her chair rather than pushing, a distinction that felt important. He'd learned her rhythms throughout the evening, adjusting his pace naturally, opening doors without making a show of assistance. Outside, the parking lot was warm, with late evening air and the distant sounds of other guests departing. Althea's car, a modified Tesla with hand controls and wheelchair accessibility features, sat under a security light that made its sleek lines gleam. "This is me," she said, pressing the key fob to unlock the doors and activate the automatic ramp system. Luis watched with obvious interest as the car transformed itself to accommodate her wheelchair, the engineering clearly appealing to his designer's eye. "That's incredible," he said. "How long have you had it?" 2 years. I had it custom modified by a company in Seattle. Cost more than my first house, but independence has always been worth the investment." The conversation felt normal, easy, but underneath ran the current of everything unsaid. Where did they go from here? How did a CEO and a janitor navigate the logistics of dating? Did they even want to find out? Luis seemed to be wrestling with similar questions. When he spoke, his voice carried careful consideration. Althea, tonight has been... I don't have words for what tonight has been. You're incredible, brilliant, beautiful, funny, genuine in ways I didn't expect from someone who's been on magazine covers. She heard the but coming and braced herself for it. But I also know that your life and mine exist in completely different universes. You have board meetings and investor calls and international business trips. I have night school and double shifts and a garage workshop. I don't want to presume that what happened tonight translates into something that could work in the real world. His honesty was both devastating and admirable. He wasn't making assumptions or pushing for promises she might not be able to keep. He was acknowledging the very real obstacles that made their connection complicated. "What are you saying?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "I'm saying that if tonight was just tonight, a beautiful, unexpected moment that stays perfect in our memories, I understand. No expectations, no hurt feelings. Just gratitude for a few hours of feeling like the most interesting version of myself." The graceful exit he was offering made Althea's chest ache with recognition. Here was someone mature enough to accept joy without demanding permanence, generous enough to protect her from any sense of obligation. It was exactly the kind of emotional intelligence that had drawn her to him in the first place. It was also exactly wrong for what she actually wanted. "Luis," she said, stopping his retreat before it could fully form, "what if I don't want tonight to be just tonight?" Hope flickered across his face before caution reasserted itself. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if I want to find out whether this," she gestured between them, encompassing the evening's discovery, "is something that could work in the real world? What if I want to see your garage workshop and meet your family and figure out how to fit coffee dates into board meeting schedules? Should love require an explanation to anyone but the two people choosing it? Tell me what you think." Luis studied her face, searching for certainty in her expression. "Are you sure? Because once we try this, once we make it real, there's no going back to tonight being a perfect memory. Real relationships are messy. They require compromise and communication and figuring out how to blend lives that don't naturally fit together." "I'm sure," Althea said, and realized she meant it completely. "I'm tired of perfect memories. I want messy reality with someone who sees me the way you do." The smile that spread across Luis's face was worth every risk she'd ever been afraid to take. "In that case," he said, pulling out his phone, "can I get your number? I'd like to take you on a proper date. Somewhere we can talk without wedding music and dance without an audience." "I'd like that," Althea said, reciting her number while Luis programmed it into his contacts. "But I have a condition." "What's that?" "Next time, I want to see those furniture designs in person. I want to hear more about your business plans, and I want to know if you're serious about seeking investors." Luis's eyebrows rose. "Are you offering to invest in my furniture company?" "I'm offering to introduce you to people who might. And yes, if your business plan is as solid as your designs suggest, I might be interested in becoming an investor myself." The offer was genuine, but it also served a deeper purpose. By expressing professional interest in Luis's work, Althea was signaling that she saw him as an equal partner, someone whose dreams deserved the same support and consideration as any other entrepreneurs. "You don't have to do that," Luis said carefully. "I don't want you to feel obligated." "Luis," Althea interrupted gently, "I'm not offering because I feel sorry for you or because I think you need charity. I'm offering because accessible design is a genuinely underserved market with massive growth potential, and your approach is exactly what's needed. This would be a smart business decision even if we'd never met." The distinction mattered, she could tell. Luis straightened slightly, his expression shifting from grateful to genuinely excited. "In that case," he said, "I'd love to show you what I've been working on. Fair warning, though, my workshop is pretty basic. Concrete floors, exposed beams, power tools that are older than both of us." "Sounds perfect," Althea said. "I started Technova in a studio apartment with furniture from IKEA. I'm not afraid of humble beginnings." They exchanged a few more details: his schedule at the church, her availability between meetings, the coffee shop near his neighborhood where they could meet midweek. The conversation had the pleasant efficiency of two people making plans they actually intended to keep. As their logistics wound down, Luis moved closer to her chair, close enough that she could catch the scent of his cologne mixed with honest work and wedding celebration. "Althea," he said, his voice soft with something that sounded like wonder, "thank you for saying yes tonight. To the dance, to this conversation, to whatever comes next. You've reminded me that some risks are worth taking." "Thank you for asking," she replied. "For seeing me when everyone else was looking through me. For treating me like someone worth getting to know instead of someone who needed help." Luis leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. The gesture tender, but not presumptuous, respectful of boundaries while acknowledging the intimacy they developed. "I'll call you tomorrow," he promised. "I'll answer," she promised back. Althea maneuvered her wheelchair onto the car's ramp system and into the driver's position, performing the familiar routine of securing her chair and adjusting controls. Through the windshield, she could see Luis waiting to make sure she got safely started, his hands tucked into his pockets, but his attention completely focused on her. She started the engine and lowered the window. "Luis? Yes? Tonight was perfect, but I'm looking forward to imperfect reality with you even more." His smile was radiant in the parking lot's security lighting. "Me too." As Althea drove home through the quiet streets, she found herself thinking about transformation. Not the dramatic, movie-worthy kind, but the subtle shift that happened when someone saw you clearly and chose to stay. She'd built her life around being impressive, indispensable, untouchable. But Luis had been drawn to her loneliness, her vulnerability, her simple human need for connection. Her apartment, when she finally wheeled through the front door, felt different. The clean lines and expensive furnishings that had once seemed sophisticated now felt sterile. The silence that had been peaceful now seemed empty, waiting to be filled with laughter and conversation and the comfortable sounds of sharing life with someone else. She placed her clutch on the kitchen counter next to the orchid she'd bought herself last week, a small act of self-care that had felt significant at the time, but now seemed like preparation for something larger. For someone who might appreciate beautiful things, who might notice when flowers needed water or when silence had gone on too long. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Althea felt her heart skip when she saw Luis's name on the screen. "Thank you for an incredible evening. I haven't stopped thinking about your smile, your laugh, or the way it felt to dance with you. Looking forward to coffee this week and many more conversations about furniture, business plans, and whatever else we discover we have in common. Sweet dreams, Althea." She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Thank you for asking me to dance, for seeing me as exactly who I am, and for being brave enough to approach a CEO who forgot she was also just a woman who wanted to be wanted. I can't wait to see your workshop and hear more about your dreams. Sleep well, Luis." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then sat in her quiet apartment, surrounded by the evidence of her solitary success, and felt something new taking root in the space between what was and what might be. Tomorrow she would return to board meetings and investor calls, to the demanding world of business leadership that had defined her for 7 years. But now she would also have coffee dates to anticipate, furniture designs to review, and the thrilling, terrifying possibility of building something new with someone who had chosen to see her not as a success story or an inspiration, but simply as a woman worth knowing. For the first time since the accident, Althea Navarro fell asleep, looking forward to being surprised by her own life. And in a garage workshop across town, Luis Ortega fell asleep sketching designs for a dining table that could accommodate both a wheelchair and the dreams of two people, brave enough to believe that love was worth the risk of being known. The end.